Welcome to our podcast of Strengthening the Community. This episode, we're going to talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the month, June, where is our awareness day of that. And so we're going to talk about that today. I have guests with me, Marielle, Christina, Ali, and Maura, and we're going to talk together about the experience of PTSD and also sort of the context of that, which is trauma. And I want us to focus our conversation around the idea, because it's a community issue. It's something that we see all around us, and we experience it, our loved ones experience it. So I really want to focus our conversation around the idea that trauma is really part of our shared human experience in the community, and that we grow and heal in connection with each other. And that's really sort of how I want us to get started. So maybe before we get into PTSD itself, let's just talk a little bit about the experience of trauma and what it's like. How does it impact us when we experience it? So, any of you guys want to just talk about how it's been in your life and how you've experienced it?
I think with trauma, it is a situation where each one of us experience trauma in different ways. As you mentioned, like, it's a human experience, right? And sometimes we don't even realize when we've experienced trauma because it's part of our normal everyday experience. And sometimes there's bigger things that are very obviously trauma, but they affect us, right? They build up. Even those smaller traumas can build over time into those bigger things that affect us more long term. So I think that's important to know, because in our trauma experience, I know I've had little things and then I've had bigger things, and each one of those plays a part in my experience with trauma.
I think a lot of us, when we think about trauma, or we think of somebody else maybe experiencing it, we think of it as a big thing, a big event, a crime, or something big, bad happened, a disaster, something like that.
Well, what you were first saying is that sometimes you don't know right away that it is trauma. For me, with my experience with trauma, it involves another parent. Mm-hmm. And so in the moment of it, I didn't realize that I was being traumatized until years later. Then I reflected back on the situation and actually admitted, yes, that was very traumatic for me, what happened. I find that when trauma involves another person, sometimes it's hard to get over it in a way, just because I'm looking for permission from the other person to come to me and say that I'm sorry that this happened. Right. And you don't always get that. Yeah. So then you kind of have to find a way to heal, a different way to heal. Yeah.
I think permission is such an interesting topic too, because one of the things that's such a common misconception about trauma is only veterans can have PTSD. Only people who see really horrific things or have really horrific experiences can have PTSD, and that's just not the truth. Children, anyone can have exposure to trauma that can result in PTSD, and that permission comes into play of realizing, how do I pick up on what I'm experiencing or my loved one is experiencing or someone that's in my life, and being aware of what to maybe look for, because the way that I might show symptoms is inevitably going to be different than how someone else shows symptoms, and that might not make sense to me, and it doesn't have to.
The idea that some of the time we might just think, well, that's just life. And, what are you going to do? Suck it up and just move forward. But really, there's something going on, and it's actually helpful to notice it and name it and be able to sort of meet it and address it.
I know for me, traumas that happened when I was younger or before I had an understanding of certain things, it led me to not fully understand it as trauma, but my body did, right? Like my understanding internally was there, but maybe not fully comprehending what was happening. So there is a level where trauma affects you deeply, even if you don't have full comprehension of what you're experiencing. So you're holding it, and it comes with you until you start to name it, start to understand it, start to unpack it. And I think that's one of the things that is super important, because even if there isn't a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis of PTSD, trauma still may be affecting someone that you love, or even yourself. And if you're not understanding how that works or fully comprehending it, you're still experiencing it, right?
A really important thing is you might not know that you're going through trauma, but your body does. That's what you said. And so there's things that you're carrying around with you that are impacted by the trauma. The people around you, your loved ones, the other people in your life might not see it as that. They might see it showing up as something else and not say, oh, that's connected to a hard experience. They're just saying, Mark, why don't you cut that out or behave better, when really there's something else going on underneath. You also brought up this important idea of the idea that we're carrying it around with us, and that it impacts you. It impacts us even if we don't know that. And so I wanted to spend a minute or two thinking through what's the outcome, or what's the impact? What does it leave in people's lives when they are experiencing trauma? Whether they know it or they don't, but what does that leave them with, or leave them without, maybe?
Sometimes it can be as simple as you just realizing that something is missing, but you just don't know what it is, or maybe you question yourself on why is it so much easier for someone going through this same situation to handle it, but maybe it's because of the trauma that you've been through that you haven't quite processed or don't really realize that you have.
I think there's other times where what you can be carrying with you can end up being twisted into a positive of looking at hypervigilance. If we make it so that you can process it with another person and make sure it's right sized, that can end up being an asset, because it's a survival skill. So this is something that I have lived through. This is something that I have survived, and hopefully at some point in my life can say I'm thriving. And that hypervigilance can be looked at as a skill and an asset, of sort of like a battle scar.
Something I'm going to circle back to a couple things, because there's just so much in the conversation. But one of the things that I think when we think about trauma, oftentimes we think about it as a negative thing, or as a hard thing, an experience of hard things. And when we start the process of becoming more aware in ourselves that this is happening, and being able to name it, maybe name it to ourselves, name it with somebody else, start that process. There's really this idea of post-traumatic growth. Like what's that about? You're talking about how, we're shaped by the experiences that we have. Not only do we get past them, but we use those experiences. Those experiences are important to us when we sort of move forward in our life. And so you end up with a spidey skill, or some sort of thing that you didn't have before, that's part of your experience, but only when we learn what it is and learn how to do it. So let's just talk a little bit about what post-traumatic recovery looks like and growth looks like.
Being able to process what you've been through when you're in a safe space, it allows you to build resilience. So to really reflect on, the coping skills you developed to survive that, and then how you can apply them in your life now and navigate them, or understand why you do certain behaviors and do things. It helps you just be more intentional. And so I think starting with having a brave or safe space to process that is that first step. It is revisiting it, and it's not easy, but when you do, you're able to heal and be more resilient moving forward.
Well, I think...
Go ahead.
No.
I think also being able to look at the ways that the trauma affects you, and realize that in certain circumstances, with some of how it's affecting you, sometimes there's a level of choice of what am I carrying with me? What am I carrying with me? What am I choosing to carry with me? And there have been times in my life where I didn't realize I can put that down.
Yeah.
There are certain circumstances where I can say I can forgive, and I don't have to have that resentment with me every day because it's not serving me. Right. And maybe I don't need this closure that I so badly thought that I needed. Yeah. And I think that realizing that there's choice in part of that, of being able to filter through what is serving me, what's not, what is in my control, what's not, it can be really powerful. Yeah.
So it's a process of growing awareness, and then being able to make some choices where before, when you didn't know, maybe you weren't free enough to make those choices about what you were going to let go of and what you were going to carry forward with you.
Trauma causes you to separate, right?
Okay.
It causes you to have disconnection, right? There's a lack of safety when it comes to interpersonal relationships. There's a lack of, especially with PTSD, it makes you feel unsafe all the time. You know, there's a level of that hypervigilance you talked about, but also just that feeling of just being on edge and not knowing where you're safe. And so you push people away, and you have that where you have to control everything. And there's a level of, until you start to recognize those cycles, and it takes time. It takes working through and healing. It takes talking with someone who can help you recognize those patterns. Because once you're kind of in that cycle and you don't recognize them, you're going to continue that cycle until you have that intervention and you start on that path to healing. And I think the downside is that we need connection to heal, as you stated in the beginning, and it really does cause you to push people away, push the things away that would really help with that healing process. But there's also that level of not recognizing what is a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship too, because that's been broken from trauma a lot of times.
Yeah. It feels like I want to sort of just stay with that moment or that period of time where we don't know what's happening. We've experienced something, but we're not quite sure what it is. And you mentioned just it feels like there's something missing, but there's a vagueness to that. And you were talking about pushing people away or feeling isolated. What else is there? Sort of like, what's the deep thing that's underneath? It almost feels like, is there a lack of hope, or there's a lack of just sort of feeling like you're stuck by yourself? I just want to sort of, before the process of naming and noticing and then talking, connecting happen, what are people sort of experiencing?
One of the things that I experienced was self-blame. Okay. In terms of something happened and why can't I sort of heal and move on? Yeah. Because everyone else is moving on. Yeah. And I just didn't know how to deal with that. Yeah. And then until I realized that blame isn't for me to hold. Right. And so I was able to work past it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sort of that knowledge or the growing awareness that allows you to say what's mine and what's not. Exactly. Sort of like what you were saying, what do I keep, what do I let go of? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I would also say there's a level, so you hold those broken parts, right? Yeah. They don't go away. They're held there. And so you're trying to operate out of this really broken place, and you're doing the best you can to kind of hold everything together. But there's a level where you can only do it for so long before it becomes so exhausting that you snap, or you have to just kind of drop everything, or you're done. You have to tap out, and you're just in the bed and you can't move, you know. And until you start to build up that strength, because you're healing those broken pieces, and you're piecing that back together, right? And making that beautiful healed mosaic, if you will. Mm-hmm. Until then, that brokenness, you're still operating from it. You're still functioning. Yeah. You're still trying to, and people would look at me and say, you're a mother, you're a wife, you're all these things, you're holding down a job, you're going to school, you know, you're doing all these things, and yet inside I'm crushed. Yeah. Inside I'm barely functioning, right? Inside I'm just trying to like figure out how I'm going to get to the next day. Yeah. And so there's that level where you're just trying to make it, right? And so that really, until you get to the place where you can even start to look inside and say, wow, this is a mess. And I have to be okay with it being a mess for a little bit until I can heal and start to work through this stuff. And that's a hard place to get into, because as a society, there's stigma, right? There's stigma around just even acknowledging trauma, acknowledging a diagnosis of PTSD. There's stigma around not being the best, or being independent, or being able to be capable, or, ask for help. All these things have a lot of stigma around them. And it's sad, because if we don't have the ability to reach out for help and have someone reach back and say, I can help you, we're going to have that space where we're just going to stay broken.
Yeah.
I love what you said about like charging forward, and how people say, oh, you're a mom, you're holding a job, you're doing this.
Yeah.
Because for me, that hit home of seeing times where not only are you isolating from other people and there's that separation from the world, but that almost creates a separation from self.
Yeah.
Because if you're putting on that front and you're trying to hold it together as hard as you can, you're not being true to the people around you, and you're not being true to yourself at a certain point. So then if you can't even trust yourself at the end of the day, that's another level of lost, where that's a reconciliation that needs to happen that can feel even more intimidating.
And there's a cycle where you're feeling like you have to control, and you have to put on the mask, or you have to put on the face to go do what you need to do today. And really what you need to do is say, the way forward is to say, wow, I sure am a mess, and I need some help with that. But it's sort of like a cycle that just sort of keeps you going in the wrong direction, and that has to break somehow. And you were talking about how sometimes life just takes over, and you can't get out of bed, and something happens, and then it's on the table, and we sort of need to deal with it.
And you can have loved ones who see that and say, hey, I think you need help. And that's what happened in my case.
Yeah.
I had a sister and I had a husband who said, you need help, and didn't necessarily know what that looked like, what help looked like, and yet still encouraged me to get help, right? So it comes down to, we don't always have the answer, but we can sometimes see when other people need help before they can see it, and just encouraging somebody to say, hey, I think you need some help might be the step for them to move forward.
We tend to share fear. So I may think about myself, there's something, I'm just not well. I think there's something wrong. I think it inside, or I feel it, or I've noticed something, and I wonder what that is. But I'm a little afraid to say it to you, because if I do, then you're going to think something about me, or you think less of me, or you're going to. I'm not sure what your response will be. And on the other hand, there have been people in my life where I'm like, I don't think they're okay, but I've been afraid to say that to them. Because I'm like, if they say, yeah, you're right, I'm not okay, and then they burst into tears, I'm like, well, then what do I do? So to your point, sometimes it's just really important to notice something and say, hey, this doesn't feel okay to me, or it doesn't feel like you're your best. And because that starts the conversation, and it's okay to start the conversation even when we don't know where that's going to end. That seems like that's a sort of a powerful thing to draw out of it when we say, how do we support each other in the community? I'm not a therapist, I'm not an expert, but how do I support other people? And noticing other people, and being brave enough to say, you would use the word brave, a brave space. And part of that bravery is just saying, hey, are you okay? And I mean that when I'm saying it, I'm not just being polite. Sounds like that was part of what your experiences were. What's the benefit of sort of coming to a diagnostic point? Maybe it's this thing. What's the benefit of that?
I think being able to give a name to something that you're experiencing allows you to, it's not a mystery anymore. So let's think about those things that we feel or we experience that don't have a name. There's a lot more fear to them because you're experiencing them, but you don't know what it is, right? So like just having a diagnosis, having something that I could put a name to it, then allows me to feel like, oh, now I understand a little bit better, right? This is why these things are happening. this makes more sense, right? And now I know how to address it too, because if I'm just trying to push through and just kind of, I'm thinking I'm doing great and just pushing through and I'm just going to suck it up, which is never a good idea. And yet we do it. Yeah. But at the same time, like as we're just pushing through and we think, there's something wrong with me, but I don't know what it is. And then when you finally get that diagnosis, there's some relief. Yeah. And there's then also, it helps you to be able to know, okay, what's the next step for addressing that, for healing? Like, what does that look like? And once you have a diagnosis, it's a lot easier than to work with a therapist who's specialized, or work with therapies that are very specific to your diagnosis, or medications or anything like that are very specific to what you're dealing with. Before that, it's just kind of, it's more guesswork, and especially when you're living with it, there's a lot less understanding of what's going on with me. Yeah.
In terms of sort of service resources, you mentioned a therapist or medication or that kind of thing. What kinds of things are helpful for people in terms of just service resources, if that makes sense?
Well, talk therapy is really helpful, just to process everything and to gain some sort of understanding of it. Yeah.
So being able to maybe talking to somebody who you're also not connected to in any other parts of your life, and they don't care how you show up today for this conversation and that kind of thing. You don't have all the baggage, all the other relational things that you have to think about. Yeah.
I think group therapy, because hearing the same things that you're feeling and experiencing out of someone else's mouth can be really powerful. Yeah. Makes you feel less alone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Especially since you were talking about the idea that one of the things that happens is we separate ourselves, we isolate ourselves. And then so hearing, well, Mark, you isolated yourself, but you're not the only one experiencing it. You can do that all by yourself over in a corner, but you don't have to.
If under a controlled environment, but exposure therapy can also work as well. Yeah. You're with a trusted professional that could help you and kind of support you and the emotions that you're having going through that.
I think when you figure out what does work for you and what isn't working for you in that recovery journey is sharing that with your loved ones as well, so they know how to be helpful. Yeah. Knowing what they might be doing accidentally that's making things worse instead of better, even if they're well-meaning. So learning to share even with those who haven't had that same experience as you.
Yeah. Like on the one hand, what do we get when we get services or we get professional resources? On the other side, I might say, well, I'm not a professional and I just need to not do anything. I just need to stand still. Or I'm afraid I'm going to break you if I say or do the wrong thing. So we've said that people heal in relationship. And so in the community, in our families, among our friends and loved ones, what are the things that are really helpful in terms for supporters to help me move forward in healing around trauma?
I know for me, the ability to have kind of parallel therapy, so your spouse and you would go through therapy at the same time, and then the therapist would be able to talk together. Many times when you've experienced trauma and you're dealing with PTSD, there's a level of not being able to verbalize some of the things you've been through. So being able to have that parallel where they're supporting your person, whether that's a spouse or it's a loved one, sibling, whoever that is, that's going to kind of be a support person to you in that process. It gives them kind of that support and that the words, the just the actions, the things to do and not do. So I would definitely say therapy along with the person who's in maybe a more intensive therapy. Yeah. I know for me also art therapy was huge when I first started the trauma journey because I did not have words. Yeah. Again, back to that whole idea of sometimes things happen before you fully comprehend what they are or what they mean to you. And so art therapy can help to bring out things that you don't have words for. And then also EMDR was super helpful for me, which is a different type of therapy that's used for, it's used for a few things, but PTSD it's super helpful for. And that helped me a lot with reducing kind of those trigger responses. But again, there's a lot of things out there, and what works for one person may not work for another person. And I think trying different things to see what works for you, and then for the people in your lives to support you trying those different things to kind of figure it out is super helpful. And I will say it is exhausting to walk the journey of healing, and it's exhausting for people supporting you. And I think we do need to name that, because there is a level of when you're in the midst of this and it's a mess, that sometimes it gets a little messier before it gets better. And I think we can celebrate the healing while still acknowledging that important fact.
If you have depression, or you have other mental health issues, you kind of know sort of an ebb and flow, and it sort of comes and goes, but it seems more gentle. It seems like it happens a little more over time. But when we talk about trauma and PTSD, we're talking about something happening, and then we use the word trigger, and I think a lot of people have heard, don't trigger me, or that triggered me, or those things that's worked itself into our sort of vocabulary in the community. We're going to talk a little bit about what's that about and what it's like, and then also, should I be walking on eggshells? How do I support that, I guess, is sort of what I'm asking about.
I think a good place to start is to ask the individual, how can I support you? Yeah. To try to figure out where you could sort of fill the gaps and be there for them in their time of need. Yeah. I would also say a level of understanding them, even if you don't quite understand, but just letting them know that, hey, I'm here. Yeah. Whenever you're ready to talk about things, I'm here to listen.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah.
It's hard because triggers are triggers, right?
Right.
I know that sounds silly, but they could come from anywhere, as you said, and especially when you're first starting out, you don't necessarily know what those are. And I think it's important for, as you're learning what they are, is to even write them down, kind of document, whether it's a running list in your head or it's somewhere where you can share that with someone else or the people who are around you, just to give them an idea of, these are the type of things that I really should not be around or should not be involved with right now. And that doesn't stay that way, right? As you heal, the triggers change or they diminish. They're not as raw. And so there's a level where you don't have to be as aware of those triggers as time goes on. But when it first starts out, having kind of that running list of just kind of knowing what those things are that are kind of problematic.
And I think that goes for the things that work to help ground you as well. So keeping that running list almost like a safety plan of, art therapy worked for you. It probably would not work for me. I'm not a good artist. I would draw stick figures, but watching stand-up comedy, going for a walk, there are certain things that I know help me feel more grounded. So having that as a go-to list of, that way it's sort of a fail-safe.
Yeah. Even as you're learning about it, say, well, if this happens to me, if I feel this, I notice this, then there's some things I know that these are my go-tos. And if I'm a supporter of you, then I'm say, oh, maybe it's time for let's turn the comedy on, or let's go for a walk, or should I come with you? To your point, should I come with you on your walk, or are you going to go on your walk by yourself? Like that kind of thing. Cool. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other hats that people are wearing in this conversation. We have the peer support talk line, and we have mobile crisis, and law enforcement, and some work with veterans, the veteran response team. So I'm going to ask in a minute or so. I'm going to ask about just sort of what are those resources and how can people get to them if they either they or somebody they know might benefit them. But I also want to sort of close the loop a little bit and say we've talked about lived experience. And so I guess my first question is, how does lived experience shape the way you think about providing the service or come to the job that you're doing? What's the impact of just reflecting on lived experience and taking that to the job?
I would say definitely a sense of not only understanding but also compassion for the person who's going through it, since you've also been through it. You tend to see things differently compared to someone who has never experienced those emotions or that particular situation. And so the individual has a better sense of who you are and tends to trust you a little bit more when you try to help them or support them.
Yeah. It feels like you're talking about being able to hold a space a little bit, even if you don't say, "Oh, I've been there, done that," or that's similar. Like even if you leave that out of the conversation, you're holding a space a little bit differently for that person than I might not know to do if I had no experience with this whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it brings a certain level to it as well. I feel when someone's explaining something and then someone says, I have had that same thing happen to me in my life. You feel a level of closeness with them, and you tend to, I feel like, I'm just going to say this, I feel like you absorb more of what they're saying compared to, professional just going by the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I would definitely say that I made the most progress with a therapist that was willing to say, I live with PTSD. And I was like, wow, you're able to live in a healed manner and use your experience to work with people. And that made me feel like there was hope. Even when it was like I was at my worst, it still made me feel like there's a future, right? Like, and I feel like that's something you can give people, Marielle, like in talking with them, like the experience doesn't have to be the exact same, right? It doesn't, but just having any kind of experience that's similar gives you that moment where you could say, I can see myself in the future almost, and then also this person gets it. I don't even have to fully explain myself for them to understand what I'm trying to say.
Words for it anyway. I'm trying to find words, and I don't even have. We can shortcut that a little bit. Yeah. You also were mentioning the idea that when we don't know what's going on, and so we sort of try to steer away from it. And then you're talking to a therapist who's not only telling you that you can lean into it, you can acknowledge it, you can lean into it. That's actually the pathway forward. But they're going through, they're looking back in the rearview mirror and saying, this is something I've been living with. And so not only can you do that for yourself, but it's possible to really pay attention to this and be healed by paying attention. So let's just talk a little bit about what you guys see in terms of some of the services that you're providing, the crisis program, Peer Talk Line, and Veterans Response Team. Just sort of what's that about, and maybe how does that help? Like what has been some of the successes of those things?
I think with the Veterans Response Team, one of the best things built on what we were just talking about, and I loved that you used the word hope, because and it sort of cuts out the vetting process. I think in any career where there sort of needs to be that quick trust, therapy, law enforcement, doctors, how can I expedite this so that we can build that trust a little bit faster? And one of the ways that the Veterans Response Team does that is through that connection, by being able to say what Marielle was talking about with, okay, so you tried to enroll for healthcare through the VA and you had to go through all this red tape. Me too. I've been there, and it's frustrating. That's a lot of red. And I've been there, and we can, and once I can speak that language, and there's certain terms and certain things that I've been through, that's sort of an instant vetting process, and it allows that connection to happen quicker. And a lot of departments in Montgomery County have signed on to have veterans response teams, and if someone knows that their loved one is struggling in any capacity and 911 needs to be contacted, they can just tell the dispatcher that they would like, if there's a veteran response member available, even if it's another jurisdiction. We've gone out to other jurisdictions who maybe they don't have a VRT member on duty. We'll go out to the call. So.
And how's that connected to mobile crisis?
Yeah, so mobile crisis, what I appreciate about is being a 24-hour response. So as we talked about, there's a lot of emotions in it. And so when you are triggered or you feel shame, to be able to have a crisis worker be able to support you through that regardless of time of day, and be a free service in Montgomery County. At least every county has a different crisis system, and it's free, but to be able to show up for people in those hard moments that you just need to feel like I need to survive and get through this, while helping them navigate getting connected to supports, whether that is the Veterans Response Team or therapy or, you know, a psychiatrist, or even help facilitate a conversation with your family of how can we do this better. We can do that and have a really rapid response to show up and have that presence and support navigating those things.
So I'm having a bad day. We were talking about like sometimes events sort of take over, and your life tells you there's something going on here. You need to pay attention. And I might call crisis because I'm feeling like in a crisis. But short of that, I think one of the things that underlies this is, and we've talked about it, is the idea that I feel like I should be able to manage it, or I feel like it, and so I could maybe get help before I was in an absolute on fire mess, if I knew that was okay to do. So when you say crisis, it doesn't have to be a 911 call. It doesn't have to be sort of like the people around me said, no, Mark, you're in crisis. You need to call. And if you don't call, we're calling that. You know, it doesn't have to be quite that bad yet. It's still something that I can reach out and get some help for.
I always wish I could change the name to Mobile Crappy Day instead of Mobile Crisis, because again, we use the word stigma. I think there's stigma with the word crisis, where people are worried that we're going to show up with flashing lights or haul them off, and what are their neighbors going to think. And really, we just want to show up when you're having a bad day, and what that looks like for one person could be different for somebody else. And so people don't have to qualify their crisis is on a certain part of the continuum of not doing well. You can just be having a crappy day.
Yes, right. Calls back when it's DEFCON 4, Mark, right?
And I think that's where I've heard some of the really great successes from peer support as well. Just it's sort of gauging, like, hey, this is what I have. Can I share this with you? What do you think? And then going like, okay, you know, you're not alone in that. And, you know, these are some resources that could help you.
And that's what's special about the peer support talk line is we are peers on the line, certified peer specialists. And a lot of us have similar situations to the callers that are calling in. And just for them to call in and hear someone say, it's going to be okay. I know because I've experienced similar, and this is how I've been able to get help. And just kind of sit with them in that situation and kind of process things with them, just being that ear that they need. A lot of times I feel like we're surprised at the amount of people when they do call in, and they're just so relieved that someone's just listening to them and validating their feelings instead of judging them, which is extremely important.
It seems too simple, but the power of holding hope and for people, and the power of listening really well to them is super important in this. One of the threads that I think we've been talking about is, on the one hand, there's some things I need to do inside myself. There's work that I do that's mine to do when I'm struggling with trauma or PTSD. But also, I probably can't do it alone. And so it seems like there's both sides of that same coin. How do we help folks in the community see that it's okay, and it's okay to get help, and we can help them get there. And then on the other hand, how do we be a support relationally to them, because we need both sides of that coin. So any last reflections on maybe that piece, or anything else that we sort of loose ends that we've left out there?
I think always modeling when somebody asks you how you are, to give them a genuine answer. Like, it's so simple, but to be able to say, I'm having a rough day today, and this is why. And it doesn't need to become a big thing, but to model it's okay to not be okay, or I am going through something. I think that creates a space of, oh, that person's honest about that. I can be real with them when I'm not doing well either. So it's simple, but I always think being honest when somebody asks you how you are, and taking a minute to check in with yourself and the other person.
And don't underestimate the power of just sitting with someone too. When people are at their most volatile moments in PTSD or trauma, they are prickly, right? They're hard to get close to, and sometimes just being there, just sitting in that space with them and saying, you know what, I'm just going to be here. I'm not going to tap out because you are having a moment and you're hard to be around, but I'm just going to be here. That is powerful. It is powerful. And it tells that person that they're worth your time and your effort, even if you don't know what to do, just being there is huge.
There was a time a number of years ago at Access when I was asked to come to somebody's house. It was a woman that was living with her family. She had an intellectual disability, and she had a lot of trauma that we hadn't really figured out, and it would show up in just really agitated and aggressive behavior. And so I was called out to see if I could help her go to an appointment, and I got there and she was yelling, and I absolutely had no idea what to say. So I sat and we watched an entire TV show together, and I sat down and said, I wonder what's going to happen. And that wasn't a therapeutic, brilliant thing to say. I honestly didn't know what was going to happen. So I said, well, I'll just sit here because something will happen. And it took a half hour, and she got up, left the room, came back with her coat and said, are we leaving or what? And I'm like, okay. And so then afterwards, everybody was saying, what brilliant thing did you do? And I'm like, absolutely nothing. I did nothing. And it actually was the thing that was most helpful for her that day. We went and got a cup of coffee, and then the floodgate opened. She told me all about what was going on, but it took that half hour of absolute silence, which is a really long time when you don't know what you're doing.
Yes, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable. And I think we need to be more okay with being uncomfortable sometimes. I think so many times we try to be comfortable no matter what the circumstances, and sometimes things just have to be uncomfortable. And sitting in a space with somebody, the first couple times you do it, it's going to feel awkward. It's just silence. You don't know should I say something? Should I do something? And sometimes that's exactly what you need to do.
Beyond uncomfortableness or discomfort is hope.
I think we talked about post-traumatic growth a little bit earlier, and we've kind of circled around both the hard times and the good times. And I think that's the beauty of this conversation, is kind of acknowledging both things. But I think one of the reasons I wanted to be part of this was because when I first started my journey in healing from PTSD and like that whole process, I didn't know what the end would look like. And having people tell their stories or hearing people tell their stories was super important to give me that hope to keep going, even when it was really hard. And so I think that that's something that I wanted to be part of giving to somebody else, even if it doesn't. I don't know where this goes. I don't know who's going to listen to this, but I hope somebody will hear this and know that there is hope and that there is healing, and that getting that connection and finding those supports that will help you to grow in and move forward is really super important. And it's possible. It is possible to heal. It is impossible to grow, even when you've had trauma and even when you live with PTSD.
And trying to give yourself grace through that process, because it isn't linear. And just because there is progress, if you end up having a bad day and symptoms get worse, that doesn't mean let's throw in the towel, because I know I have a voice in the back of my head that sometimes doesn't say the kindest things and sort of wants darkness to win sometimes, and will say, if you tell somebody about that, they're gonna reject you and they're gonna leave you there, and I think that having that, showing yourself the grace that you would give to a loved one, the grace that you would show to a loved one is really important through that. And speak to yourself the way that you would speak to someone you love.
Well, thanks for coming, guys, and talking about this. I think some of the themes that I heard that are really important is the idea of holding hope and grace, and the idea that but we extend it to ourselves, but we also extend it to each other. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about strengthening community. How do we help ourselves in community, but how do we help each other in community as well? So thanks for coming out. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope that you enjoyed hearing from people who are strengthening our communities every day. Search for and follow us on your preferred streaming platform to hear future episodes.